CEO Big Shaq thought it was a harmless stunt. A powerful man letting the black maid sit across the board. But the moment she touched the first piece, something shifted. Every move she made unraveled his pride, exposed his bias, and cornered his legacy. This wasn't a game anymore. It was a reckoning, broadcast live, and when checkmate came, it wasn't the king who fell. It was the myth of who deserved to win. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The Whitmore estate sat like an arrogant monument on the edge of Savannah's oldest grove, its columns too tall, too white, too polished to belong to anything but pride. A winding drive split through manicured hedges, leading to an iron gate that looked more like it belonged at a private museum than a home. Inside, the air smelled like cherrywood and money that had been passed down rather than earned. The estate didn't creak. It breathed, slowly, heavily, like it had watched generations of power sharpen its claws here. Charles Whitmore stood at its center like a man convinced the world owed him a favor for existing. He was old money, not just by wealth, but by attitude. A lineage of steel jaws and backroom deals. His voice oozed southern charm with just enough sugar to cover the rust. The kind of man who smiled when he insulted you and expected you to thank him for the attention. He ran Whitmore Oil like a plantation disguised as a boardroom. His every handshake calculated, every smirk rehearsed. That morning, the estate prepared for something it pretended was ordinary, a charity brunch. But it wasn't for charity, not really. It was for optics, a showcase. Charles Whitmore's favorite mirror was the admiration of others. What better way to show off than bringing in a living legend? Shaquille O'Neal arrived just past 10, stepping out of a matte black SUV that barely seemed big enough for him. Dressed in a tailored gray suit with no tie, he looked both regal and grounded, the kind of presence that silenced whispers and steadied rooms. He moved with the easy grace of a man who had made peace with being watched. His nickname, Big Shaq, followed him like a quiet drumbeat. But here, in this world of smug glances and fragile egos, he wasn't just a celebrity. He was a test. Shaq had turned post-basketball life into a mission. Youth programs, mentorships, food drives. He didn't wear philanthropy like a badge. He wore it like armor. That's why he'd agreed to the brunch. Not for Charles, but for the kids who'd benefit from the check. Still, something about this place made the back of his neck tighten. It wasn't the luxury. It was the eyes, cold, cataloging, not just watching but measuring. The kind that didn't expect black men to stand tall in marble foyers. From the shadows of the corridor, someone else watched too, but not from malice. Delilah Grace moved like a whisper through the grand halls, balancing trays and silence with equal skill. She had worked here for 5 years, long enough to learn which floors creaked and which smiles cut deepest. She wore the uniform well, black dress, white apron, hair tucked neat and safe, but her eyes told a different story, one of distance, calculation and patience. Delilah wasn't invisible. She was underestimated. She had grown used to being mistaken for someone simpler. That was her armor. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, it was with a kind of careful rhythm, like a metronome set to survival. But when Shaq arrived, something shifted in the air. Unlike the other guests, he didn't overlook her. Their eyes met for a brief second. Not flirtation, not pity, recognition. She had seen him before, of course. On TV, in ads, towering over crowds with his trademark grin. But up close, he was more than a man from commercials. He looked like someone who had fought hard battles and still knew how to laugh without bitterness. He was nothing like Charles. As brunch was served, the estate bloomed with clinking glasses and staged laughter. Charles led Shaq through the garden walk, showcasing the land as if it were a painting he had painted himself. He made pointed remarks about discipline, the American work ethic, and how some folks just don't try hard enough. The crowd laughed politely. Shaq didn't. He gave Charles a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and changed the subject. Inside, Delilah passed between rooms, catching snippets, not just words, but tones, subtext, and smug little understatements, dressed as jokes. She had seen men like Charles before, men who thought their wealth excused everything. She kept her head down, but her ears open. Later that afternoon, in a smaller salon off the main hall, a moment occurred that would seem insignificant to most, but it marked the quiet beginning of everything that followed. Charles, noticing Delilah polishing the corner of a table, called her over with a snap of fingers and a patronizing chuckle. "You any good at chess, Miss Grace?" The room fell half silent. Shaq, sipping from a lowball glass near the window, turned slightly. Delilah looked at the board set between two armchairs, the pieces carved from ivory and onyx. "A little," she answered, voice barely above a murmur. Charles smiled. That kind of smile that wasn't a smile. "Well then," he said, "how about you give it a try?" To everyone else it sounded like a joke. A maid playing chess with a billionaire CEO. Harmless. Amusing. But Shaq watched Delilah closely. Her eyes didn't blink. Her spine straightened. Just a hair. She walked to the board with quiet grace. And for the first time all day, the mansion truly watched. Not with eyes. With memory. As if its walls had seen this dance before. Power posturing as charm, and resistance disguised as politeness. No one could know it then, but the first move had already been made. Long after the brunch ended, and the echoes of staged laughter faded into the mansion's gold-trimmed walls, Delilah Grace slipped into the quiet hum of the service wing. The estate's grandeur did not extend this far. The marble faded to scuffed tile, the chandeliers replaced by flickering bulbs that buzzed like old secrets. Her room, tucked at the end of the narrow hallway, was small but neat, its corners arranged like a puzzle. In it lived a discipline most of the mansion's guests couldn't fathom. She removed her shoes, unpinned her hair, and reached beneath the bed for the old wooden box she never let the housekeepers touch. Inside was a chessboard, edges worn smooth by time, pieces wrapped in a silk cloth that once belonged to her grandmother. It had no ornamentation, no luxury, yet in Delilah's hands, it felt like the most valuable thing in the entire house. Each night she set it up with the same ritual: queen first, then bishop, then knight. White at the bottom, black at the top, a quiet rebellion in plain sight. She didn't just play, she studied. She memorized old master games by candlelight, plotted moves in the margins of her journal, and replayed defeats with the obsessive grace of someone who didn't fear losing, only being forgotten. Delilah had learned chess from her father, a former schoolteacher who spent every Sunday afternoon showing her how to see the whole board, not just the next move. He used to tell her, "The trick isn't knowing what to do, it's knowing what they think you won't." That voice still lived in her every decision. The world outside her quarters rarely acknowledged that genius. In the mansion, Delilah was called girl, more often than by name. She was interrupted, corrected, overlooked. Charles never addressed her directly unless he was making a show of courtesy. And even then, it was laced with that suffocating tone, the one that pretended she wasn't a threat. Other staff moved mechanically, but Delilah moved with purpose, subtle, deliberate. She knew how to exist in places not built for her. That evening, as she slid a rook into place, she didn't know she was being watched. Shaq had wandered down from his guest suite, his mind too full for rest. Something about Delilah's composure during the game earlier had lingered with him. There'd been no panic in her eyes, no nerves, just stillness. Not the fearful kind, the patient kind. He found himself near the staff wing without meaning to, drawn by the soft tap of wooden pieces. He didn't step inside. He stood at the threshold, unseen, and watched her play against no one. Or perhaps, against everyone. She moved the black bishop, paused, then countered with white's knight, lips pressed in deep thought, her brow furrowed, eyes scanning the board like it held more than plastic and wood. It held answers. Shaq didn't say a word. He backed away, his thoughts louder now. This woman, someone Charles had mocked in front of everyone, was no amateur. Her approach wasn't casual, it was practiced, trained, and strategic in a way that reminded him of championship pressure. She played with an awareness that came only from years of repetition and pain. This wasn't a hobby, it was a language. Back in her room, Delilah continued, unaware. The board absorbed her. Here, in this space, she wasn't a maid. She was the architect of futures. She could plan 10 steps ahead, read the cracks in her opponent's confidence. She had taught herself how to win in silence, how to flip a narrative without raising her voice. It was the only way she had survived this long. She had once been destined for more. There had been a time when she was known on school circuits as a prodigy, a black girl who moved like Pepalenka and calculated like Kasparov. But systems didn't like prodigies that didn't fit their image. She had learned that painfully, the day her scholarship disappeared under mysterious policy changes, handed instead to a more media-friendly face, Her mentor had warned her. Talent wasn't enough. Not here. Not in this America. So she'd buried her game, took work where she could, and found ways to keep playing, even if only in borrowed shadows. But now, something was stirring again. Something had cracked open when Charles asked her to sit at that board in front of guests, who wouldn't know strategy if it struck their wine glasses. She hadn't played for applause, she never did. She had played to be seen, and now Shaq had seen her. What he would do with that awareness, she didn't know yet. But she sensed he wasn't like the others. He wasn't posturing. He wasn't waiting for her to entertain him. There was weight behind his gaze, like a man who understood what it meant to earn your place in a room that was designed to keep you outside. In the dim glow of her lamp, Delilah made her final move. A quiet check. She smiled faintly, not at victory, but at precision. At the simple satisfaction of a plan that unfolded exactly as intended. She didn't know that the same discipline she showed here was about to become the most talked about play in that mansion's long and arrogant history. Tomorrow the real game would begin. And this time the board wouldn't be in her room. It would be in full view. The next day dawned bright and humid, with the kind of southern heat that clung to the skin like accusation. The Whitmore estate gleamed beneath it, polished to a smug shine, as staff bustled to prepare for the second of Charles Whitmore's charity events. A tighter circle this time. No media, no speeches, just select friends, all cut from the same silk, billionaires, legacy executives, and corporate heirs who viewed philanthropy as performance and leisure as a right. The afternoon gathering was to be held in the Rosewood Parlor, a space designed not for comfort but to impress. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the manicured garden, like artwork, and a custom chess table sat dead center, its surface carved with Whitmore family crests. It wasn't there by accident. Charles had it brought out after the brunch, left conspicuously visible, not for decoration, but for setup. He hadn't forgotten Delilah's composure during the game the day before. It annoyed him, though he pretended otherwise. That same night, over bourbon and ice, he'd spoken her name to his closest friends with a grin that didn't quite mask the edge behind it. She's got a little spark in her, that one. He'd said, thinks she's clever, might let her entertain us tomorrow. So when Charles casually asked Delilah to join the guests that afternoon for a friendly match, it wasn't out of curiosity. It was a stage. A performance. He dressed it as benevolence, told her she could take a break from chores, and show off those chess skills of yours. His tone was soaked in counterfeit charm, like a man tossing a bone to a dog in front of dinner guests to watch it beg. Delilah knew better than to refuse. Not because she feared punishment. Charles wasn't the type to fire on impulse. He was the type to degrade subtly, to make you wish you had disappeared. She accepted with a nod and returned to her quarters with a silence that hummed like tension in the walls. Shaq, meanwhile, had watched the exchange from the side. He saw the glint in Charles's eyes. It wasn't admiration. It was the same gleam he remembered from college recruiters who smirked when he read Baldwin, instead of basketball stats. A grin that said, "Go ahead, impress us. It won't change what we think you are." He didn't like it. The guests gathered slowly, drifting into the parlor with mint cocktails and idle gossip. They wore casual wealth like armor, designer loafers, silk shawls, diamond watches that never ticked. Charles made a show of it all, offering smiles like deals and seating everyone just so. And then, with a theatrical clap, he invited Delilah forward. She entered in her uniform, unaltered. No dress change, no makeup, no mask. It was a quiet defiance. She would not perform whiteness for their approval. The room hummed with a mix of amusement and curiosity. A maid at the board. Surely this was a bit of after-lunch entertainment. Delilah sat opposite Charles, hands folded. Her face was unreadable, not frozen, just composed. Shaq leaned against the fireplace mantel, arms crossed. He wasn't there to intervene, not yet, but his presence was deliberate, a silent witness. Charles made the first move. He opened with a classic, king's pawn to e4. Predictable, polished, like everything he did. Delilah responded without hesitation, mirroring his move with calm precision. Her fingers moved gently, not rushed, not showy. The board came alive. At first the room didn't notice. Small talk fluttered. Glasses clinked. But as the pieces shifted, patterns began to emerge, and the spectators leaned in. Charles, who expected quick dominance, found himself cornered early. Delilah wasn't playing safe. She wasn't defensive. She was aggressive in silence, slicing diagonals and collapsing spaces like a woman reclaiming breath. 10 minutes in, Charles began to sweat, not visibly, but in the subtle twitch of his jaw, the slight tap of fingers against wood between turns. He cracked a joke about beginner's luck, earning chuckles from a few loyal allies. But Shaq saw the cracks forming. This wasn't the script Charles had written. Delilah didn't laugh. She kept her gaze on the board, steady as a storm that refused to announce itself. Then came the turning point, a night move that shifted momentum. It wasn't flashy, but it closed a trap that Charles hadn't even noticed until the moment after he responded. By then it was too late. His queen was vulnerable. Shaq knew that feeling. The silent horror of realizing the room you control is slowly slipping through your fingers. Charles smiled too broadly now, stalling between moves, glancing at his guests as if searching for support. The atmosphere turned. The audience, once amused, grew intrigued. The idea that Delilah could actually win crept in like smoke through a crack. But it wasn't the potential victory that made the moment sharp. It was the dignity with which she played. No gloating, no celebration, just quiet execution, move by move, like she had something more important to say, without saying anything at all. Charles tried a bold attack, sacrificing a rook to distract her. She didn't bite. Instead, she let the board shrink, let him box himself into the corner he didn't know he'd built. Each of her moves told a story. I know how you think. I've studied men like you all my life. As the game neared its end, the parlor's polished surfaces seemed to tighten. The other guests watched now in full silence, the spectacle turning into something they hadn't anticipated. Reckoning. One or two looked visibly uncomfortable. They had come for amusement and found something closer to accountability. Shaq, still at the edge, felt a rare mix of satisfaction and sadness. He knew this win, if it came, wouldn't free Delilah. It wouldn't change how Charles viewed her. But it would carve a crack in the marble, a visible fracture in the illusion of superiority. And that was something. Charles took longer with each move now. His confidence had evaporated. All that remained was the shell of a man performing dignity while drowning in quiet panic. He said less, smiled less. The game had shifted from entertainment to exposure. Delilah, sensing the room's weight, remained still. Her next move would not just check Charles, it would check every guest's understanding of power. She didn't want applause. She wanted clarity. Charles looked up at her for the first time. Really looked. And for a moment his eyes showed it. Fear, recognition, disbelief. She didn't flinch. Then she moved. The board responded like a held breath finally released. Check. The room didn't erupt. It recoiled, unsure how to process what had just happened. Shaq smiled faintly. The board was just wood. But the message? That was steel. And the game wasn't over yet. The board reset, but the air didn't. It hung thick with an unspoken shift. A tension no one wanted to name but couldn't ignore. Charles cleared his throat, trying to reclaim control of the room. He offered Delilah a smirk that was meant to re-establish the imbalance, like a magician restarting a trick after the audience saw the wire. But she wasn't watching him. Her eyes were fixed on the board, calm, patient, dangerous. Shaq remained against the wall, his frame unmoving, but his mind spinning. He wasn't a chess master, but he understood rhythm, the pulse of a game, the rise and fall of energy. And what he saw in Delilah's hands wasn't luck, it was tempo. She moved with intention, not just reacting but directing. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She was here to dismantle something carefully. Charles opened with the same classic play. Pawn to e4. He wanted to reassert himself, make the room forget the close call they'd just witnessed. Delilah responded with a mirrored pawn, again choosing subtle symmetry. The first few exchanges followed textbook lines, almost too clean. Observers in the room, lulled by the simplicity, relaxed. Perhaps she had already peaked. Perhaps the earlier game had been a fluke. But Shaq didn't relax. He squinted, leaned forward just slightly. There was something beneath her simplicity. It wasn't passivity. It was a setup. She was drawing Charles in, giving him the illusion of dominance. The very tactic he used in conversation, in business, in every aspect of his life. She had learned him quickly, and now with her bishop angled like a side glance, and her knight coiled like a trap, the board began to hum with something deeper. The fourth move came, then the fifth. Shaq felt the tempo of the room shift again. Charles hesitated for the first time, not long enough to signal alarm, but enough for those paying attention to notice. His smirk faltered. He adjusted in his chair. Delilah, meanwhile, was a sculpture of control. Her hand hovered just long enough before moving her rook into position. Shaq recognized it, not the move itself, but the feeling it evoked. It was the same sensation he'd felt in Game 7 of the playoffs, when an opponent faked left only to pivot into a no-look pass. Misdirection, mastery. Now the crowd grew still, not out of politeness, but from curiosity. Something was happening they couldn't quite explain. Charles, sensing the eyes, tried to recapture the stage. He cracked a joke about Delilah's ninja-level silence, forcing a laugh that bounced awkwardly around the room. No one joined him. By move 8, Charles's brow began to bead. Not much, just enough for his hand to subtly wipe beneath his temple. Delilah had taken one pawn and sacrificed 2, but Shaq saw what Charles didn't. Those pawns weren't losses, they were positioning tools. She was maneuvering the center, controlling space without cluttering it. Every piece she moved had a shadow behind it, a history, a purpose. The guests didn't have the language for it, but they felt it all the same. What began as a parlor trick had become something more unsettling, a challenge. Charles leaned forward now, no longer pretending to be relaxed. He tapped a finger against the edge of the table and stared longer before each move. He started to overthink, doubling back on strategies, replaying her past decisions in his mind, trying to solve a puzzle he didn't know he'd been dropped into. That was the brilliance of it. Delilah wasn't trying to outplay him in the moment. She had been playing him since the first move, possibly since the first brunch. And the trap was working. Shaq watched with a strange mix of pride and dread. He admired her elegance, the restraint, the control, the psychological warfare dressed in perfect silence. But he also knew Charles, knew the type of man who confused power with immunity. The more the room saw him sweat, the more dangerous his ego would become. Not outwardly, Charles wasn't reckless, but in the quiet ways men like him punished what embarrassed them. At move 10, Delilah advanced her queen's knight. It was an innocuous placement to most, but Shaq caught it instantly. It was a mirror of a famous move, one used by Judith Polgar in a historic upset decades ago, a move only deep students of the game would recognize. Shaq's mouth twitched. Delilah wasn't just playing chess. She was telling a story. She was resurrecting a memory that had once belonged only to the world of masters. She was pulling it into this room, this estate, this moment, taking something that had always been considered rarefied and elite, and reclaiming it with brown hands and a maid's apron. Charles noticed the weight of that move, even if he didn't understand its origin. His next play was hesitant, an overreach. He swung a bishop too wide, trying to threaten a flank that didn't matter. Delilah ignored it, and tightened her center. The guests exchanged glances now, not quite pitying, not yet admiring, just uncertain. No one had the script anymore. The room had turned. The elite guests who arrived expecting amusement now sat as passive observers of a dismantling. The idea that Delilah might win was no longer laughable. It was approaching inevitable, and that's when Shaq understood something that hit him deep. This wasn't about the game anymore. It was about the gaze. Charles had set this up as a spectacle. He wanted to show off his wealth by demonstrating how harmless a black woman's intellect really was. But now, that intellect had become the centerpiece. She had inverted the gaze. They were watching her not as a novelty, but as a fort. And Charles, for all his power, had no response. Delilah made her final move for the round, a pawn push that sealed the center. It was nothing flashy, but it rendered Charles's kingside immobile. He stared at the board, blinking. He understood at last that he wasn't playing a game. He was inside one. Shaq stood now, no longer against the wall. He crossed the room slowly, and as he reached the table, he didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The move had already spoken, and it echoed louder than any speech could. As the guests drifted into other corners of the estate, shaken and silent, Shaq remained by the chessboard, his eyes lingering on the pattern Delilah had left behind. The room was still. Charles had vanished into another part of the mansion, making some excuse about needing to check on a call, but everyone knew what it really meant. He was embarrassed, and not because he lost a game, but because he had been outwitted by someone he deemed beneath him. Shaq exhaled slowly. He wasn't surprised. Not really. What Delilah had done was a quiet revolution, the kind that came not with banners or chants, but with precision and unshakable grace. It stirred something in him, not just admiration, but memory, a deeper reflection he hadn't visited in years. He turned away from the board and found himself pacing slowly through the hall that connected to the back garden. The heavy windows let in the golden afternoon light, but it felt distant, like a spotlight cast on someone else's story. The air smelled of jasmine and aged bourbon, and yet, for all the luxury around him, all he could think about was his mother. Lucille O'Neill had never played chess, but she had taught Shaq strategy long before he could spell it. She moved through life with the same silent strength Delilah had shown, not aggressive, but immovable. Lucille had been the kind of woman who never flinched when dismissed, who never cracked when dismissed by doctors, teachers, and landlords, who couldn't see past her skin. She had raised him in the heat of Orlando projects with dignity that couldn't be bought, and pride that didn't need permission. He remembered sitting on their old couch, his legs too long, watching her argue with a bank manager who'd denied her a home loan, without explanation. Her voice didn't rise. Her words didn't stumble. But when they left the bank, she held his hand tighter than usual. He hadn't understood back then what it meant. But now, he did. He saw it in Delilah. He had faced it too, just in different arenas. On the court, he was celebrated, dominant, untouchable. But off the court, the cheers didn't follow. He'd seen how quickly reverence turned into suspicion, how white coaches complimented his physical gifts, but never his game IQ, how investors smiled at his money, but flinched at his input. He remembered the boardroom in Manhattan, the one where he presented his idea for an inner-city tech initiative. They listened, they nodded, then they dismissed. Said it was too niche, too urban, not scalable. It wasn't about the pitch, it was about who was pitching. Being black and brilliant in white systems was like playing a game where the rules changed when you got too close to winning. And what Delilah had done today wasn't just win. She had exposed the rule change. He thought back to earlier in the day, the exact moment her strategy turned. It was more than chess. It was memory. Generational even. Every move she made seemed to carry the weight of someone who had been denied her rightful place again, and who had finally decided not to ask for it anymore. She didn't demand respect. She cornered it. Quietly, unapologetically. Shaq leaned against the window frame and stared out into the garden, where the shadows had started to stretch. The past played in his mind like a montage. Locker rooms, where he was the only black man. Elevators that got quiet when he entered. The way security still eyed him in high-end stores. And yet, through it all, he had stayed composed. Not because it didn't hurt, but because he had been trained to endure. He thought about that word, endure. It was carved into every black legacy he knew. His own, his mother's, Delilah's. It was a survival tactic passed down like heirlooms. But watching Delilah today, he realized something else. Survival wasn't the same as strategy. Survival kept you alive, strategy gave you power. And Delilah had power, not the kind measured in wealth or position, but the kind that rewrote perceptions, that made people look again, think again. She had used their assumptions as a weapon, made them comfortable just long enough to let them walk into her trap. It was, in a word, genius. Shaq found himself smiling. Not the broad public smile he gave fans, but a private one, the kind that recognized something sacred. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like the only one carrying the weight. Delilah had picked it up too, and she didn't stagger under it. She carried it like it was part of her, not a burden, but a responsibility. He knew then he couldn't let this moment pass. Not just because it was a personal revelation, but because it needed to echo beyond that parlor. Her brilliance had to be seen, not as an anomaly, but as a truth that had always been there, just waiting for someone to look closer. Back in the main hall, the murmurs had resumed. Guests tried to recalibrate their narratives, to twist the story into something more palatable. She's probably played before, they muttered. Maybe she got lucky. Maybe Charles was distracted. Excuses bloomed like weeds. But Shaq wasn't listening to them anymore. He looked once more toward the service wing, where Delilah had quietly disappeared. He knew what was coming. The attempts to rewrite what just happened, to downplay it, bury it under politeness and champagne toasts. But something had cracked. And once a legacy is seen, no shadow can erase it. The game hadn't ended. Not yet. Though Charles clearly wanted it to. The guests had returned, slowly drawn back into the parlor by the gravitational pull of discomfort. Something unusual was unfolding, and they couldn't look away. The casual arrogance that usually saturated the estate like cologne had begun to dissipate, replaced by something more volatile: tension. Delilah sat upright, hands still, eyes focused. She wasn't aggressive. She didn't need to be. Her presence had already redefined the room. The early laughter had dried up. No one whispered anymore. Even the servers walked more slowly now, glancing sideways at the board as if its pieces had grown teeth. Charles tried to reassert his control, snapping his fingers for another drink, cracking stiff jokes about strategy and beginner's intuition. But none of it landed. His voice had lost its command. The guests responded politely but without spirit, their attention sliding back toward Delilah like iron filings to a magnet. The board was unfamiliar territory now, not in layout, but in atmosphere. Delilah had shifted the rhythm of the game from convention to something looser, more creative. She wasn't following standard playbooks. Her sequences bent traditional rules just enough to unnerve anyone expecting a textbook approach. It was chess, yes, but alive, unpredictable. And it rattled Charles. He leaned forward, squinting at her latest move. A pawn push, seemingly benign, but Shaq saw it for what it was: a gambit layered with intent. It forced Charles into a corner, not a physical one, but psychological. If he ignored it, the flank collapsed. If he responded, he left his back row exposed. Shaq remained off to the side, his arms crossed as the air thickened. He studied Delilah not just as a player, but as a presence. She wasn't rattled, not even remotely. Her moves weren't reactive. They were narrative. Each decision felt connected to something older, deeper, as if she was speaking through the board, telling a story only a few could hear. And Charles wasn't one of them. He moved his knight too early. A misstep. The room didn't notice right away, but Delilah did. She tilted her head slightly, fingers pausing above a bishop, and then she moved, quick and quiet, claiming the open file Charles had left unattended. A ripple ran through the room, not applause but breath held. Charles blinked, his lips twitched. He laughed, short and sharp. "Well, you're a slippery one, aren't you?" he muttered, more to himself than to her. Delilah offered no response. Her silence, once mistaken for submission, now sounded like judgment. Charles shifted in his chair, the fabric of his tailored suit whispering under the strain. He wasn't used to losing. Not in this room, not on this board, and certainly not to someone who served his food and disappeared through servant doors. The game stretched on. The minutes slowed. Delilah's pieces pressed inward, slowly but undeniably. She didn't play like someone climbing toward victory. She played like someone claiming space that had always been hers. Shaq watched the crowd more than the board now. He saw the discomfort spread, unspoken but shared. The guests weren't used to this dynamic. Their host uncertain, a black woman commanding the room, without speaking a word. It wasn't just unfamiliar. It was destabilizing. Charles tried to stall the tide. He leaned back in his chair, gesturing toward one of his guests, a tech investor from Austin, and made a sarcastic comment about AI taking over chess. A few forced chuckles echoed, but even those allies weren't laughing with conviction. They were watching Delilah too now, watching her create something none of them had expected: dominance. But Delilah wasn't celebrating. Her face didn't change. If anything, her eyes had grown sharper. She wasn't playing for pride, not in the way they thought. There was something beneath her moves, a reason that ran deeper than the insult Charles had intended with his invitation. She played like someone who had waited for this moment for years. Like this wasn't just about showing skill. It was about restoring something that had been stolen. Shaq caught it in her posture, in the careful timing, in the sacrifices that only made sense when you zoomed out. She wasn't trying to win quickly. She was making sure he understood why he lost. And Charles, he felt it now. Not just the game slipping away, but the symbolism. The room no longer belonged to him. The weight of centuries-old entitlement was failing, under the pressure of one woman's deliberate hands. And for a man like Charles, there was no worse fate than being exposed. Not as cruel, but as unimpressive. His next move came too fast. He advanced his queen into a vulnerable line, trying to bait Delilah into an exchange. But she didn't take it. She moved a pawn instead, securing the center. Charles stared, confused, then angry. He couldn't see the trap yet, but it was there. Shaq saw it unfold like a memory, a snare built not for speed, but for certainty. Delilah was controlling the tempo, dictating not just the outcome, but the pace at which it arrived. The next two moves confirmed it. Delilah had Charles boxed in with pieces that didn't look threatening until they were. Every diagonal was guarded. Every escape line closed quietly. Charles leaned back again, but the confidence had drained. He wasn't thinking about the next move. He was wondering how many people in the room would remember this moment. And they would. Because this wasn't just about chess. This was about hierarchy, about performance, about a system that invited someone like Delilah to the table only to mock her, and ended up choking on her brilliance. Shaq took a deep breath. He had seen games that shifted culture: finals, last-minute buzzer beaters, but never like this. Never in a silent room filled with power, cracked open by a woman who never raised her voice. Delilah moved once more. A rook slid into alignment. Check. But not Maid. Charles still had one way out. Delilah left it there, intentionally. Not because she couldn't end it, but because she wanted him to see the shape of it, to sit in it. She wanted him to realize he was no longer in control, and hadn't been for several moves. The room sat still, but the shift was done. Delilah had already won more than the game. She had rearranged the room, without moving from her chair, and the king was still on the board, not to be spared, but to be seen. Long after the room thinned, and Charles lingered in a corner nursing a defeat he wouldn't admit, Shaq remained close to the chessboard, its final position preserved like an open wound. Delilah had stepped away, returned to the staff wing without fanfare. She left as quietly as she'd arrived, but now every room she passed felt different. Not because she had spoken loudly, but because she'd shown what silence could do when paired with memory. Shaq couldn't let go of the unease. The game was stunning. Yes, but there was something else in the way she played. A rhythm, a fluency that couldn't be self-taught in stolen midnight hours alone. She hadn't just studied the game. She had lived in it, and it didn't feel like a comeback. It felt like a return. That night, he found himself seated at the edge of the estate's private library, fingers tracing the spine of a photo album Charles had left open on a desk. Most guests wouldn't have bothered, but Shaq was trained in noticing patterns. He turned pages slowly, casually, until a face stopped him. The photo was over a decade old, a local newspaper clipping. It showed a group of teenage chess champions standing shoulder to shoulder at a regional tournament. Centered in the front row was Delilah, younger, smiling faintly, holding a gold medal. Her eyes looked the same, sharp, curious, unswayed. Shaq narrowed his gaze. He scanned the names beneath the photo. One of them caught his attention. Douglas Fairley. He remembered that name, not from the courts but from a Whitmore board meeting, months ago. Charles had introduced him as a brilliant analyst recently promoted to VP of Special Projects. A quiet man with a permanent smirk. Shaq pulled out his phone. He searched the archives. Delilah Grace, U.S. Youth Chess Championship finalist. Two-time regional gold, ranked among the top 10 under 16. And then, a disappearance. Her name dropped off listings after a controversy involving a withdrawn scholarship. Rerouted unexpectedly due to an administrative error. That error had led to another name taking her place at a private elite academy. Douglas Fairley. He hadn't just worked under Charles. He'd been protected by him. Shaq leaned back in the leather chair, a slow wave of anger building in his chest. Delilah hadn't just been a promising player. She had been exceptional, a once-in-a-generation strategist. Her career hadn't ended. It had been taken. Suddenly, the earlier game made sense in a way it hadn't before. The restraint, the careful moves, the measured tempo. It wasn't just art. It was calculation. Every step was shaped by something older than pride. Delilah hadn't played Charles to embarrass him. She played him to confront the system that had made her vanish. Shaq saw it now. The game wasn't spontaneous. It was planned, not for the spotlight, but for justice. The next morning, before anyone stirred, Shaq found her outside by the servants' side entrance, watching the sun rise over the fields. She didn't turn when he approached, didn't greet him, but he stood beside her in silence, letting the hush speak first. "I saw the photo," he finally said. She closed her eyes, just once. "Then you know." Shaq nodded, slowly. "Fairly stole your scholarship." "He didn't steal it," she said, her voice dry. "He was handed it, wrapped in excuses." Her words weren't bitter. They were factual, heavy and smooth, like stones polished by time. She wasn't interested in sympathy. That had passed. What mattered now was clarity. You planned that game, Shaq said, not accusing, not even surprised. You knew who he was. You knew Charles would bring it up. Delilah looked at him then, her eyes dark and resolute. I never stopped playing. I just stopped letting them see me. It was the most he'd heard her say in 2 days. And yet it told him everything. The truth hit deeper than he expected. She hadn't come to reclaim a title. She'd come to dismantle a legacy that had profited from her erasure. And she'd done it not by shouting, but by making them see what they'd tried to bury. The power of her performance wasn't in its brilliance. It was in the revelation that she had always been brilliant, and they had known, and they had chosen to ignore it. Shaq looked out over the estate. The fields soaked in early light. The mansion behind them gleamed with empty pride, its walls filled with curated stories. But not this one. Not anymore. I want to help, he said quietly. She didn't answer at first. Then she nodded once, slowly. Not in gratitude, but in agreement. She wasn't asking for saviors, but she would accept an ally. That afternoon, Shaq made a call to a journalist he trusted. Not for headlines, but for history. Because this wasn't just a chess game. It was a reckoning, and it had just begun. The parlor was full again, but quieter than before. The weight of the earlier match still hovered, shaping the air into something taut and uncertain. Guests stood nearer to the board now, not as spectators, but as witnesses, their smiles cautious, their words brittle. Charles had insisted on a rematch, framed as good humor, another round just for fun, but his tone betrayed the urgency of a man clawing to reclaim his pride. Delilah accepted with a nod. Not for sport, for closure. Charles sat opposite her once more, this time adjusting his cufflinks with unnecessary precision. He pretended calm, but every movement showed how deeply the earlier loss had shaken him. Delilah, on the other hand, was motionless. She wasn't there for revenge. She was there for instruction. The first moves unfolded, like a slow dance, classical openings, measured exchanges. Charles played sharper, more focused. Gone was the casual condescension. He now studied every square with the desperation of someone trying to stay ahead of something he didn't fully understand. But Delilah didn't rush. Her tempo was steady, her eyes distant, like she wasn't just playing a game but telling a parable. Midway through, the board grew tense. Charles had recaptured 2 pawns and developed his pieces quickly. For the first time in the match, he smirked with genuine satisfaction. He saw an opportunity. Her queen was isolated, pushed too far forward. She didn't move it. Instead, on her next turn, she left the queen hanging, wide open, no defense in sight. The crowd noticed instantly. A murmur rippled. Even Shaq, watching from the mantel, felt the breath catch in his chest. Sacrificing the queen at this stage was absurd, unless it wasn't. Charles pounced. His rook swept in with gleeful precision, capturing her queen in a move he declared with unnecessary flair. The guests exhaled in collective relief. Well, that's that, Charles said with a theatrical sigh. Hard to come back from that one. Laughter returned, uneasy but present. Some leaned back in their chairs. Others began sipping from their glasses again. The room resumed its familiar hierarchy. Charles, smiling now, gave a small shrug, as if to say, order restored. But Shaq didn't move. His eyes remained locked on the board, on Delilah's hands, still calm, still precise. She hadn't flinched. Not when the queen fell, not when the room turned, not even when Charles laughed. Because she hadn't lost control. She had traded it. Her next move wasn't flashy. A single pawn slid forward, quiet, unimposing. Most in the room didn't recognize the threat, but Shaq did. The position had changed. The lines had shifted. Delilah's pieces were suddenly converging around Charles's exposed king, guided by pawns that had slowly advanced in silence. And now one of them stood just a few moves from promotion. It was audacious. Sacrificing her queen to open the path for a pawn. No one saw it coming, because no one expected it. That was the point. Shaq exhaled softly. He understood now. The queen wasn't the game. She was the distraction. The pawn had always been the story. It mirrored something deeper. In life too, Delilah had played this way. Forced to sacrifice, to survive, to endure. She had given up opportunities, names, dignity, not by choice but by design. But with every sacrifice, she had moved forward. Quietly. Alone. Just like the pawn. In chess, the pawn is underestimated. Its movements are simple, its power limited. But only the pawn, when it reaches the other side, can become anything. It carries within it the seed of transformation, not granted by status, but earned through passage. Delilah's passage had been long, brutal, silent. But now it stood on the edge of becoming. Charles stared at the board, finally sensing the trap. His king was boxed in. His queen, though captured, had done nothing. His remaining pieces were scattered, disorganized. He tried to calculate, tried to reset, but Delilah moved again. Another pawn closed in. The crowd's mood shifted once more. No one laughed now. They watched in stunned silence as Delilah's trap unfolded. Not a burst of brilliance, but a slow, suffocating truth. The queen was never the centerpiece. The pawn was. Charles leaned forward, visibly rattled. "You got lucky," he muttered. Delilah didn't answer. Shaq stepped closer to the board. His voice, calm and low, broke the silence. "She didn't get lucky," he said. "You just don't know how to see the ones who start at the bottom." A hush fell across the room. No one responded. On her final move, Delilah advanced her pawn to the last rank. She didn't announce it. She simply reached for a queen, a new one, and replaced the pawn without ceremony. It wasn't for show. It was for From nothing, she had returned as everything. The game was done. Checkmate was 3 moves away, but the outcome was already written. Charles didn't even see the end. He stood abruptly, muttered something about being late for a call, and left the room in silence. No applause followed. Delilah remained seated, eyes on the board, the memory of her original queen still echoing in the space she had left behind. She had made her point, not through domination, but through transformation. She didn't need to win with power. She needed to win with principle. And in doing so, she reminded everyone watching that sometimes the strongest piece isn't the one born powerful, but the one that walks alone, step by step, until the board has no choice but to bow. The parlor was quieter than ever, but not empty. A different kind of silence hung in the air now, one that didn't invite calm, but confrontation. The chessboard remained untouched after Delilah's promotion, the final configuration frozen like a painting mid-brush stroke. Charles stood behind his chair, red-faced and rigid, unwilling to sit back down. He couldn't call it a loss. He wouldn't. Not in front of them. Instead, his fingers gripped backrest like he might crush it, and his voice, low, but trembling with restrained venom, cut through the silence. She cheated. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, eyes flicking toward each other, unsure whether to agree, laugh, or leave. No one spoke. Not yet. The claim hung like a bad smell, thick and sour. It wasn't shouted. Charles wasn't that clumsy, but it was loud enough to infect the atmosphere, to give the others permission to doubt what they'd just seen. Delilah didn't flinch. She stayed seated, hands in her lap, eyes fixed on the board, as if Charles's words hadn't landed, as if they didn't matter, and in a way they didn't. Not to her. But Shaq heard it, and this time, he stepped forward. Not fast, not theatrical, just steady, like a man used to being watched and unafraid of it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When Shaq spoke, the room always listened. "No one cheated, Charles," he said, tone firm but calm. "You just didn't expect to lose to someone you didn't think mattered." A brittle chuckle broke from one guest, but it died quickly. Charles turned toward Shaq, the flush in his face darkening. "You don't know anything about this. She's not even." He cut himself off, catching the weight of his own sentence before it fell. Shaq tilted his head, just slightly. "Not what? Trained? Talented? Qualified?" He turned toward the room, not to confront, but to clarify. "She was a national youth chess champion," he said. "Twice. Took down ranked players before most of us were shaving. She had a scholarship to an elite academy until someone sitting in this room took it from her and handed it to a boy they thought would be better for the press. Vashon." Now, the room really fell silent. Eyes widened. Glasses paused mid-sip. There it was. The breach. The uncomfortable truth surfacing like a hidden bruise. No one had expected a story beneath the game, let alone one this ugly. Shaq continued, slow and precise. "That boy's name was Douglas Fairley. Now he works for Charles. And Delilah? She ended up here, cleaning the floors of the house she was meant to outgrow." He didn't glare at Charles. He didn't need to. The truth did the work. Charles looked rattled, more so than during the match. He opened his mouth, but nothing coherent followed. His power had always relied on perception. the belief that he was always in control, always one step ahead. But now the narrative had escaped him. Shaq turned back toward Delilah. She didn't cheat. She remembered. She came back to a table that was never meant to seat her, and she beat the host on his own board, using rules he thought she didn't know. Delilah finally looked up. Not at Charles, at the others. She didn't speak, but her silence now held weight, not absence. It demanded that they not look away. One of the women near the back stepped forward slightly. She was older, wrapped in pearls and discomfort. "Is that true?" she asked softly, as if the floor beneath her might split open if she raised her voice. Delilah nodded once. "I never stopped playing." Charles scoffed. "This is ridiculous. You all came here for charity, not some sob story." But the guests weren't on his side anymore. They weren't angry. They were ashamed. They had laughed at the match earlier. They had assumed it was harmless fun, but now it felt like complicity, like they had been players too, just on the wrong side of the board. Shaq stepped back, allowing the silence to bloom again. Delilah rose from her seat. No announcement, no speech, just the slow, graceful movement of someone who had nothing left to prove. She didn't pack the board, didn't touch the pieces. She left it as it was, a monument to something deeper than victory. As she walked past Charles, she paused just long enough for her presence to register. He looked at her but saw something he hadn't before.
Not defiance.
Certainty. She continued toward the door, and as she passed Shaq he gave her a slight nod, not of approval, but of respect. The guests stepped aside for her like a tide shifting. And the room, once ruled by illusion, felt the foundation shake. For the first time they realized that power didn't look like them anymore. It looked like her. The endgame was here, and no one could unsee it. The room had stopped breathing. The pieces hadn't moved in over a minute, yet the tension pulsed in the air as if a final move had detonated something sacred. Charles stared at the board as though it had betrayed him. His shoulders were tight, his eyes locked on the neat alignment of pieces that now left his king defenseless. There was no rout, no bluff, no miracle. Checkmate. And he knew it. But he said nothing. No declaration. No concession. Just silence, and the cracking weight of his own ego folding in on itself. Around him, the room remained still. The same guests who had toasted his charm now looked at the board with unease, and at Delilah with something that felt suspiciously like reverence. She remained seated, her hands in her lap. No smile, no satisfaction, just stillness. The kind born of endurance, not triumph. She didn't need to gloat. The truth was visible to everyone now, including Charles. She had won, not just the game, but the narrative. The assumption that this room, this game, this world belonged to him alone, had collapsed with the soft sound of her final move. And yet her victory wasn't loud. It was composed. It was earned. Delilah slowly stood, smoothing the front of her uniform with an elegance that made it feel more like royal garb than servant's attire. Her eyes met no one's in particular. She didn't look for approval. She didn't need it. Instead, she leaned slightly toward the board and began resetting the pieces, one by one, not out of duty, out of ritual. It was a quiet reclaiming of the space, as if she were restoring balance to a world that had long tilted against her. The bishop, the knight, the rook, each piece returned to its home with care. The king, last, was placed gently in its square, not in mockery, but in respect. The game was over, but she treated the moment like it mattered.
Because it did.
Shaq watched her from a few steps away. His chest was tight, not with anger, not even with pride, but with something harder to name. Recognition, maybe. Awakening. Certainly. He had seen many wins in his life, had delivered them himself on courts echoing with cheers. But this one was different. It had no scoreboard, no lights, no confetti, but it would echo louder than any of those ever had. As Delilah gathered the board and turned to leave, the guests parted like curtains, some stepping back instinctively, others too stunned to move. Charles remained frozen behind his chair, eyes now cast downward, hands limp at his sides. He had not been beaten by strength or aggression. He had been undone by poise, strategy, patience, all qualities he had failed to recognize in the very person he tried to mock. Delilah passed Shaq, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met. No words exchanged. No need. It was the silent acknowledgement of two people who had carried weight too long in spaces not built for them, and who, for once, weren't carrying it alone. Shaq fell into step behind her, his stride easy but heavy with thought. The hallway they walked through now felt different than it had when he arrived. Not smaller, but more honest. The paintings, the chandeliers, the polish, all just decor now, stripped of their illusion of superiority. Something had changed today. Not just in a room filled with wealth and legacy, but inside him, deeply. He had spent years moving through elite spaces, learning the dance of diplomacy and charisma, wearing smiles that made other people feel safe. But watching Delilah, it reminded him that some battles aren't won by fitting in. Some are won by refusing to disappear. As they reached the staff wing, Delilah turned down a narrower hall. She didn't expect him to follow, and he didn't. He stopped, letting her walk alone, not out of distance but respect. This was her moment, her silence, her board. He watched until she disappeared around the corner, the sound of her footsteps fading into stillness. Behind him, the mansion stirred again. Murmurs rose, chairs scraped, guests began to excuse themselves, retreating into polite exits and hushed conversations. But the room wouldn't recover, not entirely. The illusion that power looked a certain way, sounded a certain way, had been cracked open.
And the king?
He had fallen, without a fight, without fury, just the soft, undeniable thud of being outplayed, not by brute force but by brilliance he never thought to fear. And that sound would haunt him longer than any applause ever could. The Whitmore estate looked the same from the outside, all grand arches and pristine hedges, but inside, something had shifted. Not visibly, not yet, but the air that once carried certainty now held something else. Tension, unspoken, and impossible to ignore. Within 24 hours, the footage leaked, not officially, not with headlines or press releases, just a phone clip, recorded in secret, grainy and angled from behind one of the marble pillars. It captured only the final minutes of the match. Delilah's quiet pawn advance, Charles's increasingly erratic play, the slow, deliberate checkmate. No one needed audio. The silence spoke louder than words. The videos spread like wildfire. At first it lived in whispers, group chats, text threads, curious retweets from anonymous accounts. Then, overnight, it bloomed. Headlines followed. CEO humiliated by housemaid in public chess match. Maid outsmarts billionaire at society gala. Queen takes king. The real chess story of the year. But it was the framing that disturbed the elites more than the facts. Delilah wasn't just featured. She was respected, admired, celebrated, and that terrified them. They had seen her as background, a fixture in Charles' curated home, quiet, obedient, ignorable. Now she was center stage, and she hadn't even spoken a word. Her silence had become her power. Every frame of the footage reeked not of rebellion, but of presence, of calm certainty. It made them uncomfortable in a way they didn't know how to articulate. Shaq didn't let the moment drift into novelty. He moved swiftly, quietly, but with direction, just like Delilah had. A call to a friend at a reputable journal. A recorded podcast episode where he laid out her history, her childhood titles, the scholarship theft, the erased potential. He made sure the story wasn't just about a game. It was about the system that had buried her, and the brilliance that refused to stay buried. Delilah never asked for it, never chased the spotlight. But once it found her, she didn't run. She stood firm, even as invitations began arriving. Morning shows, podcasts, exclusive interviews. Most were declined. She agreed to a few, the ones that promised time, not spectacle. No flashbulbs, no spin. The first televised segment aired on a Tuesday night. Delilah sat in a simple navy dress. No makeup, no lights beyond the bare minimum. She spoke clearly, if sparingly. Her words were sharp, but measured. She didn't tell the story for sympathy. She told it for truth. I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone, she said. I just wanted to be seen as I am, not as what they assumed. And somehow, that made it worse for the elites. They didn't know how to handle her. She wasn't angry. She wasn't loud. She didn't demand reparations or scream injustice. She simply laid bare a mirror and asked them to look. And what they saw, that stung. Charles went quiet. No official statement. Just vague murmurs about private matters. A week later he stepped down from the board of his foundation. His image, once untouchable, now lived beneath a layer of social media derision. Memes followed. Articles dissected the symbolism of his loss. Every echo of his name came with a shadow. But Delilah never spoke of Charles again. She moved forward, not around him. She returned to her modest quarters for another week before resigning, not with drama, but with a handwritten note of gratitude to the housekeeping staff. No farewell event, no revenge. Shaq met with her the same evening. He offered her more than a gesture. He offered a space, a project under his foundation's banner, a mentorship program that would introduce chess to underserved schools across Georgia. Delilah wouldn't just be the face. She'd be the architect. She accepted with the same quiet resolve that had checkmated a king. The first week of the program's launch saw record enrollments. Kids came not because of Shaq's name, but because they had seen the clip. They'd watched her silent, poised, commanding a board no one thought she belonged on. And they understood something the world was slow to accept. She wasn't a fluke. She was a force. The halls of the elite, so used to polished narratives and recycled accolades, trembled beneath the weight of something they couldn't package. A maid had walked into their world and left with the one thing they held dearest: credibility. And she did it without asking for their permission. Delilah's storm wasn't loud. It didn't rage or demand. It moved like her game, quiet, calculated, unstoppable. And now even the marble halls couldn't keep the echoes out. A year later, the mansion looked smaller. Not physically, the towering arches and grand windows remained. But the weight it once carried had thinned. It no longer loomed in the same way. Its silence wasn't power now. It was memory, and memory, as Shaq knew, could either haunt or humble. He stood just beyond the iron gates, watching as ivy crept slightly higher up the columns. There were no parties today, no clinking glasses, no curated laughter echoing through marble halls. Whitmore Estate had become a relic, not a spectacle. Since Charles's quiet resignation, the mansion's legacy had faded from influence to trivia, a place people referenced in whispers, like an old scandal buried beneath polished stone. Charles hadn't spoken publicly since the fallout. The board pressured him out within weeks. Shareholders distanced themselves quickly, while media ran headlines not about oil deals or corporate milestones, but about the match, the woman who had walked into the lion's den and made the lion blink. And Delilah? She didn't just survive it. She built something from it. Shaq smiled faintly as he remembered the day she first walked into the downtown community center, the one his foundation had renovated from an abandoned gymnasium. She wore the same expression she'd had during the match, calm, steady, slightly distant, like she was measuring a board no one else could see yet. The Kings and Queens Initiative. She named it. Her idea. Her terms. It wasn't just about chess. It was about reclaiming space. Mental, emotional, strategic. A place where black and brown children could sit across from each other and learn how to see the world, not as it told them it was, but as it could be reshaped. The program opened with 12 kids. By the second month, it had 60. They came from every corner of the city: public housing, foster care, overworked single-parent homes. They came for something they didn't know they needed: a way to think, not just about winning, but about navigating structure, pattern, consequence, resilience. Delilah didn't teach with fanfare. She rarely raised her voice, but she held presence, and that was enough. The kids responded to her, in a way even Shaq hadn't anticipated. They weren't impressed by her headlines. They were inspired by her focus, by the way she treated the game not as a performance, but as a mirror. She taught them what no one had taught her: how to own their minds before the world tried to sell them something else. One morning, during a weekend session, a boy named Lennox, tall, awkward, gifted, stayed behind after class. He asked if it was true, what they said online, that she'd beaten a billionaire in front of 100 people, that she didn't even flinch. Delilah smiled and said, "I didn't flinch because I knew what I was doing." You don't flinch when you've seen the board before. That quote went viral weeks later, shared on Shaq's page, picked up by educators, reprinted on shirts worn by young players across the state. It became the heart of the movement, the soul of the program. The initiative expanded. By spring, they had launched satellite classes in 2 more cities. Volunteers signed up in droves, not just for chess, but mentorship, tutoring, creative strategy building. Delilah's name was spoken in rooms that once laughed at her, and not as a token, but as a blueprint. She became a symbol. But more importantly, she remained a guide. Shaq stepped through the gates now, walking slowly up the driveway. He hadn't returned since the match. He hadn't needed to. But something pulled him back, a need to close the circle, to measure the distance between what was and what had been claimed. He reached the parlor where it all happened. The chess table was gone. The chairs were covered in white cloth, dust gathered along the baseboards. The room hadn't hosted anyone since Delilah left it in silence. He stood there for a long time, then pulled a small object from his coat pocket. A simple chess piece, a white queen, smooth, unmarked. He set it gently in the center of the table, not to commemorate her win, but to remind the room who it had failed to see. Outside, the sun crept lower. Golden light spilled through the wide windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Shaq walked back out, his thoughts heavy but warm. There was a time he believed power lived in stature, in presence, in public applause, but now he knew better. Power wasn't in height, or money, or skin. It lived in memory, in the ability to hold your ground when no one expects you to, in knowing when to sacrifice the queen, and when to become her. He paused at the front gate, and looked back one last time. The mansion didn't intimidate him anymore. It was just a place, a structure filled with stories, and now, at last, one worth remembering. Somewhere in the city, Delilah was likely finishing up a class, maybe helping a kid navigate their first endgame, maybe reminding them that the pawn isn't weak, just early, that with vision and resolve, even the smallest piece could reach the other side, and stand tall. A queen in her own right. If this story moved you, remember it started with one underestimated voice refusing to stay silent. Share it, discuss it, let it spark the kind of conversations that shift rooms and shatter old narratives. Support brilliance where the world forgets to look for it. Because sometimes the greatest moves happen off the board, and they need you to see them.